Welcome to Design Emergency, the podcast that investigates design's fundamental role in our life and in that of all species and ecosystems. I'm Paola Antonelli, and together with Alice Rawsthorn, I believe that design is not only one of the highest expressions of human ingenuity, but also a means to address emergencies big and small, even and especially those of our making. Alice and I today will discuss the concept of infrastructure and its design manifestations. Infrastructure is the foundation of modern life, but it often escapes popular notice until it either triumphs, as in some success stories of public transport innovation, or it fails. Think of some disaster movies that see the planet riddled by malignant beams spat by Starlink-like mega-villain-owned satellite meshes, hint, hint. So transit, water, sewage, electricity, data, these systems shape how we live, move, and connect, and they're not neutral. They reflect decisions about access, hierarchy, and control. Alice and I both participated in this year's Prada Frames Symposium during Milan Design Week, organized by our friends Forma Fantasma, entitled In Transit. Infrastructure emerged as a central theme, not just as physical support, but as a lens on the movement of people, goods, and power. The conversations made one thing clear: infrastructure isn't just technical, it's cultural. It encodes values, worldviews, and geopolitical agendas. Infrastructure is where some of the most consequential design is happening. In this episode, Alice and I will discuss the design interface of some of these infrastructures. Some are large-scale, even global systems with significant geopolitical implications. Others are more localized, adaptive interventions. And design is both the basis of their existence and the lens through which we can read them diagrammatically and understand them. And we'll start with the basics, right, Alice?
We will. Well, that was a brilliant opener, Paola. And as you said, infrastructure is the foundation of modern life, yet it has often been ignored and continues to be ignored, much to our detriment. But that's changing because this is an epic age for infrastructure, when the combination of leaps in technology, significant shifts in the global balance of economic power, and tragically the plethora of ever deadlier and more destructive wars is fueling a mammoth increase in investment in infrastructure of all types. Not that this is new, as the same catalysts have triggered similar explosions of activity for centuries. So I'm going to give just a very brief history of three particular infrastructure projects that have been especially influential. Now, one is the Arsenale in Venice, the cluster of armories and shipyards that were built between the 12th and 16th centuries on an enclosed area of 110 acres, that's 15% of Venice's land. And it was hailed as Europe's biggest industrial complex before the Industrial Revolution and as an early example of mass manufacturing. The Arsenale was designed to enable sails, masts, ropes, and every other component of battle and cargo ships to be prefabricated for speedy installation on vessels as they literally floated through the production line. Now the home of the Venice Biennale, currently the Architecture Biennale, the Arsenale played a crucial role in securing Venice's economic, cultural, and military might in an era when it was one of the world's richest, most powerful, and crucially, most innovative cities. Then we could consider the reconstruction of Paris in the mid-19th century under the aegis of Georges Eugène Haussmann, alias Baron Haussmann, who was charged by the Emperor Napoleon III to transform France's decrepit historic capital into a modern metropolis with a booming economy, in what was then the biggest public works project ever to be undertaken in Europe. Haussmann nearly doubled the size of Paris by demolishing hundreds of buildings and building thousands of new ones, as well as public parks, 50 miles of boulevards, 2 railway stations, and the world's biggest theatre, Charles Garnier's Opéra de Paris, while laying hundreds of miles of water and sewage pipes, as well as gas pipes to power the newly installed street lights. Over 350,000 people were evicted from their homes to facilitate these works, which cost a colossal 2.5 billion francs. Haussmann was eventually ousted by his political enemies, but his transformation of Paris inspired other ambitious urban renewal programs worldwide, from Berlin, Cairo, and Buenos Aires to Vienna and Madrid. But another of my favourite examples of ambitious, ingenious and efficient infrastructure projects happened at roughly the same time, but on the other side of the Channel. The design and construction of London's sewage system by the great 19th century British civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette. London's original sewers were woefully dilapidated, not least as they'd been designed and built to service a city with far fewer people, and deposited untreated waste into the River Thames, turning it into an open sewer and a major health hazard. These problems crescendoed in the summer of 1858, when a hideous stench, swiftly nicknamed the Great Stink, spread across London from the river, fuelled by a noxious combination of human and industrial waste and hot weather. Bazalgette and his team planned and delivered an ambitious design solution by building a network of 1,100 miles of street sewers, which fed into 82 miles of underground sewers, which transported waste miles away from the city. This mammoth undertaking also included the construction of new pumping stations, including Abbey Mills in East London, a structure so imposing that it was nicknamed the Cathedral of Sewage. Bazalgette insisted that Abbey Mills should combine elements of Gothic, Byzantine, Italian medieval and Moorish architecture to remind Londoners of how important his diligently engineered sewage system would be to the city's future. Bazalgette personally checked every part of the new system and strove to ensure that it would meet London's needs for decades to come. His bold response to a dire emergency helped not only to reduce the risk of more great stinks, but to curb cholera, typhus and typhoid. His sewers are now over 150 years old and were designed for half the current number of Londoners, but they have served as well. Even so, they're no longer fully fit for purpose, and after a decade of construction, a new 16-mile super sewer should be fully operational by the end of this year. As well as capturing London's sewage, it will store it until it's been safely processed, thereby preventing it from poisoning the Thames. Paola, over to you.
See, dear listeners, all we want in life is to make you appreciate the extraordinary beauty of sewers. Seriously speaking, but it's like when you go through life loving design, you just find beauty or ugliness in pretty much everything. So that's what we would like to share with you. And that's why so many of our episodes are quite autobiographical. And I'm going to proceed, in fact, with another autobiographical sort of bit, which is about maps, especially subway maps. So maps are not just tools for navigation. They are representations of how we believe that a city should be understood. And nowhere is this more evident than in the design of subway maps, which sometimes come to represent cities as much as their most visible monuments. I will talk about 3 subway maps, and the first one that I'm going to begin with is my own city, New York, which sports a memorable subway design. And I would like to talk about the infamous Vignelli map. So in 1972, Italian designer Massimo Vignelli created a new map for the New York City subway system. It was abstract, geometric, unapologetically modernist, as was kind of Massimo, more or less. Angles were limited to 45 and 90 degrees. Manhattan was distorted into a rectangular spine, and Central Park was a rather puny square. And the map prioritized clarity over geographic accuracy. This approach kind of mirrored the aspirations of its time. New York was in the midst of turbulence, crime, bankruptcy, decay, and the map presented a vision of order, control, and rationality. It was part of a broader trend in 20th century design, the belief that systems could be tamed through grids, color coding, and visual hierarchy. However, many New Yorkers rejected it. They couldn't find where they were on it. The map was soon replaced by a more geographically faithful version, but today, the Vignelli map is celebrated as a design icon, and notably, in April of this year, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, MTA, unveiled a new subway map that draws inspiration from Vignelli's original design. It features bold lines and simplified borough outlines. Let's see how much it lasts, and let's see if times truly have changed. But in contrast, London's subway map, which was first designed by Harry Beck in 1933, was an immediate success. Like Vignelli, Beck abandoned geographic realism in favor of a schematic approach, and the underground, the tube, was shown as a circuit diagram, clean, legible, modern. Stations were spaced evenly, the Thames was stylized, and London accepted this abstraction more readily. And the city's identity, particularly in the post-war decades, was one of functional civility and imperial legacy. And Beck's map became not only a wayfinding tool, but a symbol of the city's self-image, together with its amazing graphic design. It also had timing on its side. Beck's design emerged before mass suburban expansion, when geographic distortion wasn't yet a practical obstacle. And a third great symbol is Tokyo's subway map, which embraces instead density and complexity. With multiple operators, overlapping lines, more than 100 interchanges, the map looks chaotic to the outsider, but to Tokyoites, it's entirely navigable. The design philosophy here is different. Not minimalism, but layered systems thinking. Color coding, station numbering, and multilingual labeling, at least now, not the first time I visited. They all combine to make a deeply complex infrastructure functionally comprehensible. Rather than suppress the city scale, the map reflects Tokyo's ethos, hyper-efficiency, precision, and tolerance for overload. It's a design of accommodation and not simplification. So the design of subway maps reveals how cities see themselves or want to be seen. New York pushes back against systematization, London absorbs it, Tokyo thrives on it. Each map is a diagram of a city's psychology and not just its infrastructure.
The way that these maps are interpreted is truly fascinating. And I think a crucial issue is that because the London map, Beck's diagram, as he insisted on calling it, never a map, was introduced in the 1930s, generations of Londoners have seen that as the map of their city. So most Londoners believe that the River Thames is straight, it's impossibly wonky, and literally picture the city as Beck depicted it all those decades ago. Whereas I think for New Yorkers, because the grid has really imposed a lot of discipline on the way the city has developed, it is much more difficult for them to accept that sort of exchange of clarity, factual accuracy that Londoners, we knew it was in our interest to absorb it. We're a predominantly medieval city in the original centre, topsy-turvy, roads going this way, that way, and all over the place. And so Beck saved ourselves from the idiosyncrasies of our city. And you could argue the same could apply to Tokyo, but as you say, they brilliantly have embraced them.
You're so right, but I remember a Korean graphic design studio that at some point started remaking subway maps from all over the world. And I remember that it had remade the Tokyo subway map, trying to make it into a heart. It was so hilarious because you truly couldn't recognize the city anymore. Yeah, no, it was terrible. It was cute. But truly, I think that most people, when they think of a city, they think of graphic design first and foremost. They might think of one or two, monuments, but the graphics of the subway map, the graphics that are used on the freeways that you use to get from the airport into the city, are truly what leaves the first impression.
Absolutely. But I'm now going to talk not about cities, but a country, and specifically the country which is currently the reigning global infrastructure powerhouse in terms of quantity and in some, but not all respects, the quality of the infrastructure it produces. And it is, of course, China, which has made unprecedented investments, not only in designing and building new physical infrastructure, super cities, high-speed rail and road networks, clean energy generation, electrification, electric vehicles, advanced loading dock technologies, to give just a few examples, but in radically redesigning the materials, construction processes, and crucially software systems it uses both in China itself and in its allies, predominantly in Africa and Latin America, where it has acquired or created crucial areas of infrastructure, including most of Latin America's commercial ports. Now, China has three key advantages in doing so, and these tend to crop up with sort of mega infrastructure champions historically. One is, of course, that as a rapidly developing economy, and a humongous one, it can afford to do so. Another is that China until recently was a largely rural economy, so it has therefore been able to leapfrog long-established industrial economies in North America and Europe by building new infrastructure from scratch, rather than having to patch up existing systems and structures that are no longer fit for purpose, as, for example, London's super sewer project has done. And the third is the old cliché that the best and keenest infrastructure builders are often authoritarian regimes that are able to ignore local protests and fears about the negative implications of new infrastructure for the environment and for communities, their microeconomies and cultural identities. Now, tragically, much of China's infrastructural development has realised those fears, and these problems continue. But it has also had successes, notably in reducing emissions and cleaning the air in its cities through new infrastructure initiatives, such as the increase in clean energy consumption and transition to electric vehicles. But a number of Chinese architects, designers and engineers have seized opportunities to design new infrastructure projects that are already regarded as models to be applied worldwide, and one is the ingenious Sponge City flood management program designed by the landscape architect Kong Jian-yu and his team at his Beijing practice Turenscape. Kong Jian-yu once described designing landscapes in an escalating climate emergency as akin to the art of survival. And as the emergency has intensified, flooding has, of course, become a major problem worldwide, including in China, where half the cities are considered vulnerable to major floods after decades of aggressive industrialization. Kong Jian-yu has devoted over 20 years to developing alternatives to the traditional grey infrastructure of concrete dikes that are intended to protect vulnerable cities and towns from flooding, but often have the opposite effect by trapping the water, thereby causing greater damage. Inspired by the natural flood defences he remembers from his rural childhood, he and his Turenscape team have designed sponge cities as bespoke networks of strategically located ponds, streams, paddy fields, greenways and natural earthworks which steer water along the natural courses of nearby rivers, helped by clusters of mangroves, banyans and other carefully selected trees that act as natural embankments. They're proving highly effective at defending China's heavily polluted cities against flooding by draining the water away naturally. And Turenscape, by doing this, has already transformed the ecologies of huge areas of metropoli, including Beijing, Nanchang, Shanghai, Taizhou, and Tianjin, by constructing and cultivating sponge cities there. As Kong Jian-yu described it, this is a solution to a local problem that can contribute to tackling a global issue.
And definitely, you're reminding me something that is not a secret at all, that infrastructure is a pathway and a tool for not only colonialism, but also for the penetration of other economies and other culture. But I was wondering as you were speaking, because you started out by talking about infrastructure as hard power, but then sponge cities seem more to be an example of soft power, like a model that could be exported elsewhere in a way that is almost like giving a gift to other cultures. So it's not about building railroads in Eastern Africa. And it's not about building bridges in Ethiopia as Italy did in the 1940s, but rather it's about exporting new models. So the political power of infrastructure is really paramount, right, Alice?
Hugely. I mean, as you rightly said, it is the foundation of modern life. The quality of our lives is in direct relation to the quality of our infrastructure. But for so long, it has been ignored, considered boring. There's been very little design discourse about it. And there absolutely should be more, because infrastructure is of huge importance. So the more we know about it, the better.
And maybe the way to know about it is to visualize it. And that's why visualization design, we keep on hammering on that point, is so important today. And right now I'm going to talk about an infrastructure that is mostly invisible. So the internet and the AI infrastructure are often described in immaterial terms. They're described as clouds, flows, streams, but these systems are grounded in heavy, tangible infrastructure. And one of the first time I encountered this very straightforward but not immediate consideration was in 2012 when Andrew Blum published Tubes. It was a book called Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet. So at that time, he traced the physical geography of the Internet of yesteryear, its data centers, switching hubs, undersea cables. He visited, which is kind of cute, 1118 8th Avenue here in New York, one of the largest carrier hotels of servers in the world at that time, as well as a modest building in Ashburn, Virginia, which hosted a major chunk of the world's internet traffic. So these places were banal on the outside, but critical to global connectivity. And their design, unmarked, secured, and modular, reflected their status as strategic assets and also as invisible nodes of these infrastructures. Blum also tracked the landing stations of transoceanic fiber optic cables, showing how geopolitics, real estate, and weather all shape the global map of the internet, and so does aggression. Remember the Estlink 2 cable that was severed on Christmas Day in 2024, and how a Russian tanker, possibly a ghost official vessel from Russia, was blamed? So these cables are crucial. They are as thick as garden hose, and they carry more than 95% of international data. They're buried beneath the oceans, but laid out with meticulous precision, designed to avoid fault lines, shipping routes, and deep sea ecosystems. And in another book that was crucial to my formation and consciousness as a citizen, which is Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, which came out in 2021, she shifted the focus from information logistics to extraction, power, and inequality. Very interesting. Those 9 years of difference also talk about a different shift in the consideration of climate change and in the consideration of footprint. So she examines in this book how training a single large AI model, such as OpenAI's GPT-3 at that time in 2021, can emit over 550 metric tons of CO2, which is roughly the same as 5 US households' annual carbon emissions. So these systems rely on data centers, many of which are concentrated in water-scarce regions like Utah or central Spain, where they consume millions of gallons of water annually just for cooling. Crawford also visited mines in Inner Mongolia, where rare earth elements essential to GPUs and batteries are extracted, leaving behind toxic tailing ponds and polluted air. And she argues that every interface, every so-called intelligent assistant or recommendation engine, is connected to a global chain of designed infrastructure, from the sensor to the server to the supply chain to the land. So both books converge on a key point. These systems are not weightless. The neutral user interface on your screen obscures the spatial, material, and ecological costs of digital infrastructure. I remember when Forma Fantasma, our friends again, a few years ago, came up with a streamlined website that tried to minimize all this. And if traditional infrastructure was once about roads, pipes, and wires, today we must include the architecture of data, from the rack layout in a server farm to the thermal design of a cooling system to the territorial negotiations over cable landing points. These are infrastructures that shape economies, politics, and the environment, and designers now sit squarely at the table of how they are visualized, operated, and experienced. And maybe one of the details that most drove the point home for me was an understanding of the energetic costs of being kind to my AI agent. I found out that to be a responsible citizen, I have to train myself not to say please to ChatGPT, because I heard that it adds watt hours to my consumption. So there you go. I'm afraid that this change of behavior might then overflow into my daily life. So pardon me if I'm going to be rude to you, Alice, in the future. No more pleases.
A sobering thought indeed. Well, you mentioned the A word, aggression, there, Paola, and I am going to pick up on it right now because I'm going to talk about battlefields, or rather what potentially happens to them and the hidden infrastructure that's left there when the battles are over. Because admirably ambitious and resourceful, though so many infrastructure design projects have been at different scales over the centuries, many of them have been products of terrible tragedies. So examples would be the large-scale reconstruction programs of affordable housing, schools, hospitals, libraries, museums, and other civic resources across Europe after the devastation of World War II, which has been replicated elsewhere after other conflicts. And we live at a terrifying time of multiple conflicts, from continuations of ancient wars, such as Russia's centuries-old efforts to conquer Ukraine, to a plethora of new ones. And infrastructure is a prime target in all these wars, as it has been throughout history. But a significant change is that design advances in military technology and weaponry have proved terrifyingly effective at destroying infrastructure at scale, as illustrated by the physical devastation wrought by the Israeli army throughout Gaza and by Russia's targeted attacks on coal mines, railways, ports, power plants, nuclear and otherwise, in Ukraine. One of the many admirable facets of Ukraine's response to Russia's illegal invasion has been its foresight in adopting a strategic approach throughout the conflict, not only in terms of military strategy, but in how to reconstruct its economy and society afterwards. And among its many ambitious and imaginative strategic plans for post-conflict reconstruction is the National Mine Action Plan, which prepares for the safe removal of the deadly infrastructure of unexploded mines, grenades, cluster munitions, and other explosives, which have turned 25% of Ukrainian land into dangerous no-go zones. Over 1,000 civilians have already been killed by these explosives, which have made 140,000 square kilometres of Ukrainian land too dangerous to be used. The impact is horrific. Tens of thousands of people have lost access to their homes, businesses and farms, with devastating consequences for their employees and the customers they can no longer supply. The Ukrainian economy loses $11 billion of GDP a year, including $9 billion of exports, most of which is urgently needed food and grain previously supplied to precarious regions of the global south, thereby imperiling global food security. And to put this in context, before the war, 90% of Ukraine's wheat exports were shipped to Africa and Asia. Now, Ukraine is currently the most heavily mined country on our planet, and the World Bank has estimated the cost of safely demining it at nearly $35 billion. The National Mine Action Strategy estimates that it will take 10 years to make 80% of the affected land productive again, which will require 10,000 specially trained deminers, a third of whom are already in post, and substantial supplies of demining equipment. So Ukraine's tech designers, who've already made remarkable contributions to the war effort, thanks to their collaborations with the military in developing ever deadlier and more precise drones as weapons and surveillance devices, are already applying their research into drones and AI to produce new forms of demining equipment, as well as devices to survey land in order to identify live explosives and then to test whether they've all been rendered safe and the demining process has been completed successfully. Now, all of this R&D can, of course, then be applied in Gaza, Sudan, Ethiopia, and other war zones to support their demining programs. It's also interesting to note that one of Ukraine's greatest defensive assets in this heinous conflict has been a Russian-funded infrastructure project constructed during an earlier invasion of Ukraine. The network of over 100 underground bunkers and 2 6.5-kilometre tunnels beneath the Dnipro River in Kyiv, which were commissioned by Joseph Stalin in 1939 to strengthen the city's defences against a possible German invasion during World War II. Today, Stalin's underground structures have, of course, proved absolutely invaluable in protecting Kyiv's citizens during Vladimir Putin's air raids.
Take that, Stalin, you thought. Yeah, take that. No, but I have to say that it's not only places like the Ukraine or Gaza or Ethiopia or Sudan or Afghanistan where these problems persist. They also have remnants in our safe countries. Like in Italy, the railroads tend to close some spots of their tracks regularly to remove World War II bombs. It's really interesting. War leaves scars and also active fires that are so hard to remove. So thank you for bringing this up. I'm going to move now to another infrastructure that is extremely important. And there are so many mine. I mean, we could have 15 episodes on this topic, but I want to talk about cooling. So cooling, the infrastructure of cooling, is not a matter of comfort. In many places, it's a matter of survival. As you have heard many times from us and elsewhere globally, average temperatures have already risen 1.2 Celsius degree above pre-industrial levels, and they're on track to exceed 1.5 as early as the 2030s. So the frequency, duration, and intensity of heat waves are increasing worldwide. In 2022, Jacobabad in Pakistan recorded a temperature of 51 Celsius, that is almost 124 Fahrenheit, and it's dangerously close to the threshold of human survivability outdoors. Even in Phoenix, Arizona, the summer of 2023 saw 31 consecutive days above 110 Fahrenheit, that's 43 Celsius. So today, more people die from extreme heat than from any other climate-related hazard. In response, cities and designers are developing new forms of cooling infrastructure beyond air conditioning, and they often rely on traditional methods. So, for instance, at this year's Venice Architectural Biennial, the Kingdom of Bahrain, where the average temperature is 28.5 Celsius, was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation with a project aptly titled Heatwave, curated by Andrea Faraguna. So I have to give a disclaimer. I was one of the judges together with Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Paul Matsipa. And so this heat wave is a prototype of a suspended canopy system designed to mitigate extreme heat, which could be deployed modularly over large areas where people have to work outdoors, like markets and even construction sites. And I have to say that is what convinced us, because we know well how workers' conditions on construction sites in the Gulf and in that part of the world are often precarious. Another good case study is the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, India, which launched the world's first heat action plan in 2013 after a deadly heat wave in 2010. So the plan is structured around early warning systems, public awareness campaigns, and infrastructural interventions that also change behaviors. Among the most impactful are the installation of reflective cool roofs in informal settlements and the expansion of water access points in public areas. Furthermore, color-coded heat alerts inform residents of risk levels. Very simple and straightforward, and the model has been replicated in over 20 other Indian cities. Ahmedabad shows how citywide cooling can be achieved through a combination of low-cost design and policy coordination. And epidemiologists have concluded that the heat action plan helped avert more than 1,000 deaths annually. A recent World Bank study finds that extreme heat early warning systems, when coupled with an interagency response plan, have benefit-to-cost ratios exceeding 50-1. They are worth it, right? In the so-called global north, we can go to the city of Los Angeles, which has been riddled by fires lately, but we're going to talk about a different form of heat, which is the normal heat that comes from climate. The city of LA has implemented a Cool Streets program to reduce surface and ambient temperatures in heat-vulnerable neighborhoods. This includes applying a reflective coating called Cool Seal to road surfaces and increasing tree canopy coverage. The reflective coating reduces surface temperature by up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And the program prioritizes underserved communities, acknowledging that urban heat is unevenly distributed, and often it's correlated with historical patterns of redlining and disinvestment. There is such a thing as climate justice, as we know. And though still limited in scale, The initiative is an example of how cities can use targeted design interventions that combat heat inequity. There are many other global models. Medellin in Colombia has implemented an extensive green corridors program. In West Africa, the Nubian vault building technique has been revived. It's based on mud brick vaults. Or in Melbourne, Australia, the government is expanding the urban forest to find a double canopy by 2040. So many different cities in the world are showing us that cooling infrastructure is not a singular technology, but rather a system of material, spatial, and social design. And it is feasible by also engaging the population.
Well, fantastic that there's so much innovation in such an important area. And as Paola has said, as with so many of the big design challenges that we discuss on Design Emergency, there's always much, much more that we could talk about. And in terms of infrastructure, there's India's airport building boom, the $15 billion, 1,000-kilometre Trans-West African coastal highway that's currently under construction to connect 12 countries from Mauritania to Nigeria, to the doubling of global investment in space exploration infrastructure that's forecast between now and 2032. But sadly, we're out of time. So in an era when technology is advancing at ever greater speed, the political and economic outlooks are increasingly turbulent, often terrifyingly so, and the grave damage caused by the climate emergency and surge of global conflicts will continue to enhance our need for more infrastructural innovation, this fundamental area of design will become increasingly important. So thank you all very much for joining Paola and I for this Design Emergency Double Act. You can find images of the projects we've discussed on our Instagram feed at design.emergency, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency soon, when we'll be talking to another global design leader at the forefront of positive change. Goodbye.
Bye.